We're here at the historic Riverside Cemetery in Waterbury, Connecticut. Now, Waterbury, Connecticut is a city that is probably well known to many philatelists for one reason, and that reason are these beautiful fancy cancellations that were created in the mid-1860s, 70s, and 80s. Now, the reason we're here at Riverside Cemetery is because this is the final resting place of Mr. John W. Hill. John Hill was a Civil War veteran who returned to Waterbury in the mid-1860s looking for a job and became a clerk at the post office. He was elevated to the role of postmaster in 1869, a position he held until 1886. And John Hill, in addition to being postmaster, was something of an amateur artist. He was very creative. His friends would say he would whittle things out of the head of a cane or a piece of wood. He could carve an entire chain out of a single block of wood. And he decided to use his artistic proclivities when it came to canceling the mail. In the 1860s, the cancellations that were used on mail were oftentimes drab or boring, and postmasters across the country sometimes felt inclined to carve little designs, whether they were geometric or little faces or little hearts, things that would help spruce up the mail that was leaving their post office. But of all the postmasters across the country who created these fancy cancellations, foremost is John Hill. He is considered to be sort of the Michelangelo of fancy cancellations. His designs are highly prized, in many cases quite expensive, and I thought it was important to come to Waterbury, Connecticut to pay my respects to Mr. Hill, who again has left us with these great postal relics 150 years later. But when it comes to Waterbury cancellations, and there's some great ones. These range from whimsical, like the famous running chicken, which we sold earlier this year for $310,000. Some of them are more practical, a heart for Valentine's Day, an elephant for a local circus, a baseball diamond for a local baseball game. When it comes to these cancellations, there's something that has always sort of eaten away at me, something that's always troubled me. And that is, I've always wondered where the cancellations were created, where John Hill's post office was in the 1860s and 70s, because I want to know, where was the birth of the famous running chicken? Where was the birth of the famous Bridgeport fireman? So this is a question I decided to ask myself when I decided to come pay my visit to John Hill in Riverside Cemetery. I also wanted to figure out where these beautiful pieces of American folk art, they're more than postal history, they are Americana, they are art in and of themselves, and I wanted to figure out where these things were created, which set me on a quest that was much more difficult than I anticipated. I thought this would be a simple thing to figure out, but after many, many hours of research, hundreds of historic maps, photographs, and newspapers, I found myself pulling my hair out trying to figure out where the post office was. We're gonna head to downtown Waterbury, a short distance away, and I'm gonna continue the story there of trying to track down the mystery of where John Hill's post office was and where the Waterbury fancy cancellations originated. We're standing here in front of the Apothecaries Hall building at the intersection of Main Street and Bank Street in downtown Waterbury. Now, Apothecaries Hall is one of the oldest Waterbury companies, originally founded in the 1850s. This building behind me is from the 1890s, but it's on the site of the original building. And I know that we're close to where the post office was because Connecticut postal historian Bill Duffney said in an article that Postmaster Hill would walk across the street from the post office to buy ink for the post office at Apothecaries Hall. Obviously, this building has seen some changes. All of downtown Waterbury has seen a lot of changes over the years. There was a massive fire in 1902 that wiped out entire blocks. So most of the buildings around me are from the 1890s, early 1900s. Very little dates back to the 1860s and 70s when the fancy cancellations were being created. A lot of the streets have been rerouted. It's very confusing trying to figure out what is what, but I will explain my research in a second. But the good news is I have a very convincing theory that the original location of the Waterbury Post Office was located right over here. So we are across the street from Apothecaries Hall, still on Bank Street. There's an alley behind me that used to be Harrison Street, and we're in front of a very old building that I believe marks the site of the Waterbury Post Office. Now, the biggest issue I encountered in trying to determine the location of the post office is that in directories, in newspaper articles, in advertising, everybody knew where the post office was, so the locations of everything else were given in terms of the post office. The baseball club met across the street from the post office. a drugstore was 2 doors north of the post office. Since everyone knew where the post office was, nobody had to say where the post office was. It was just putting other things in terms of the post office. So this was a huge issue. The other problem is that Waterbury did not have a dedicated post office building at the time. It was a town of only about 10,000 people. The clock and brass businesses were just kind of starting, and there was no dedicated post office building like many cities would have had. So instead, the post office moved around from shop to shop inside of other pre-existing buildings. But after a lot of research, overlaying maps, looking at old aerial photographs, looking at old postcards, I've determined that the building behind me, which was constructed sometime around 1870, is either where the post office was or on the same site as the post office. And I will put photos up showing some of the research that it took to uncover this. But it took a very long time, hours and hours and hours of digging through, again, hundreds of original sources to determine that this is where Postmaster John Hill created his famous postmarks. Now, obviously, like I said earlier, downtown Waterbury has changed considerably since then, but to stand on this site, to see the building where John Hill may have stood, again, nobody knows exactly when this building was built, but we are here, we've solved this mystery, we've cracked the case as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure there's some other Connecticut or Waterbury historians out there who may have more information, so there may be a part 2 of this story coming in the future, but for now, I feel confident that we're on the site where John Hill's post office was, where the running chickens, the Bridgeport firemen, all of these great iconic cancellations were created. So this building behind me, even though it may not look for much, it's derelict, it's dilapidated, it has changed a lot over the years. The top floor was taken off at some point. To me, this is philatelic ground zero. This is one of the most important buildings in the history of stamp collecting, because this is where John Hill's fancy cancellations were created.